I'd like to apologize at the beginning. On Kol Nidre we say, Anu mitirim litpalel im ha'avaryanim. There's no way I'm going to get through today's session without crying. Az anachnu mitirim litpalel im ha'bachyanim today. And I apologize. Afterwards, I don't know why I'm apologizing, but today is a difficult session to give. Hi, and welcome to the Hartman Institute. There's one other reason why my father loved teaching you. And in addition to what Lauren said, he also felt that you understood him. That you understood the nuances of what he was teaching. That you understood the nuances of a living covenant. That you understood that the living covenant was not a journey away from God. It was not to create an atheist Judaism, but it was to create a different relationship with God. You understood that his search was to create a modern Judaism and not to run away from Judaism in the name of modernity. All of you and all of us who teach were always misunderstood. We're misunderstood because people here, number one, sometimes we're not that clear. But also we're misunderstood because people hear what they want to hear. He felt that you really hear him. You heard him. You listened to him. And you were unbelievably generous listeners. You were unlimiting in your love for him. And he felt it every time he taught you. And there's no group in the Jewish world who he preferred to teach more than you. None. None. Not the wealthiest donors in the world, not Christian theologians. This was the group who he wanted to teach to. Because this is where he felt in the deepest sense that his Torah was alive. And I also want to just start on a personal note, besides the other personal notes, is the way in which all of you and the North American Rabbinic responded to his death. It was such an outpouring of love. He would have wanted to hear it. He would have really, really wanted to hear it. He would have enjoyed it. He wouldn't have believed it. Because still in his mind, part of what compelled him, he was still Duvi in Brooklyn, who failed twice in elementary school, and whom everybody said he would never amount to anything. And so even though he did pretty well in his life, he never really believed it. So to hear the beautiful things that all of you said and wrote for our family, it was my whole family in this institute is in your debt. And while we've done this before, it's very, very meaningful to continue that tradition of being an institute that defines its core identity as an institute that loves rabbis. And doesn't just love rabbis, that respects rabbis. And an institute which feels that it is most alive when you are here, and who believe that there is no group of people to whom we would rather share our Torah than with you. And so welcome. Welcome, and it is a celebratory, but it's not only, it's also sad. It is sad. Okay, now I'm going to try. What I'd like to do this morning is introduce a conceptual framework of my father's teaching. And one of the things that when someone is alive, you don't do is you don't conceptualize them. because they're there. They're the concept. They're there talking, and they're there teaching. And especially in the context of my father, if you tried to conceptualize him in his life, not only would you be wrong, he would be sure to tell you that you were wrong. Because he couldn't conceptualize himself, because part of him liked to live in a world of contradictions. But as somebody's life, and I started thinking about this as his life was coming to an end, and it's now our job to teach his Torah, but to teach him and to give him a voice, the voice that he doesn't have, and to give him a space that he can no longer hold. What I'd like to do is to teach you this morning 3 things that my father taught me throughout my life. 3 things that, for a strange reason, I remember when he taught them to me. And it's only as life progressed and as I began to reflect on his teaching and what his philosophy was, that I understood that these 3 core teachings define in many ways everything that he stood for and everything that he yearned to create. My father was my teacher my whole life. He was teaching me formally from the age of 3, when I was given a seat on the pulpit at the age of 3. The informal education started beforehand. But while he was teaching me my whole life, I wasn't necessarily listening. I was ADHD, and sometimes I heard, sometimes I didn't. But there's 3 things that he taught me. 1 when I was 8, 1 when I was 14, and 1 when I was 19, that I remember to this day. I actually even remember the moment. I could, and I don't remember a lot of, I remember the moment of the teaching. I remember the experience of the teaching. I remember what I felt at that moment. And I remember that I felt that something critical was being communicated to me at that time, even though I didn't necessarily understand fully its implication and its consequences. In many ways, this is the first thing that I remember my father teaching me. Occurred when I came home from school. And he asked me, Donniel, what did you learn in school today? And as many of you know, and I've said this many times, in our family, what you learned in school today was code for what Torah did you learn that day. My parents had no interest whatsoever in anything else that I studied. My father in particular. Math, sciences, they didn't understand them. And therefore, what I learned in these subjects was like for them some bizarre, they understood it might be necessary in some universe. My father wasn't completely convinced that all of it was necessary since I was going to become a rabbi, obviously. But I never as a child ever received any help in math, sciences, literature, geography. After my father failed elementary school, there was no help to be given. It was like, if you did bad in math, I had a great childhood, because if you failed in math, I could come home and I could fail in math. My parents would look at the report card and say, oh, it's math. What else are you supposed to do with math? And so when he asked me, what did you study? I'm like, what were you learning in either Chumash or Gemara? And at 8, I wasn't learning yet Mishnah or Gemara. I was just learning Chumash. And he said, what did you learn? And I don't remember what I answered to him. But on the basis of the conversation, what I'd like to do is to reconstruct that with you until we get to his answer. Because what we're going to learn is but one example on which that conversation could have taken place. Let's please turn to Genesis 21. Donniel, what did you learn in school today? And my answer could have been, oh, I learned about Hagar and Yishmael and Sarah. And I learned how after Abraham finally had a child with Sarah, and Sarah in verse 8, 9, after Isaac is weaned, Sarah saw the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham playing, mitzachek. She saw him playing, and she said to Abraham, "Cast out that slave woman and her son, for the son of that slave shall not share in the inheritance of my son Isaac." Donniel, what did you? Oh, I learned all about Hagar and about Ishmael, and how God said to Abraham, "Kol asher yomar lecha Sarai, shma b'kolah," listen. And how Ishmael gets kicked out of the house. And my father asked me the following question. And I don't know if he asked it about this, but it is one of the questions that he asked me over and over and over again. Donniel, what do you think? What do you think about? What do you think about the kicking out of Ishmael? And I remember distinctly responding to my father as follows. Oh, Rashi says. Now what does Rashi say? Rashi said, what's mitzachek? Source 2. Mitzachek is an expression of idolatry, as it is said, and they rose up to make merry. Another explanation is an expression of illicit sexual relations, as it is said, to mock, l'tzachekni. Another explanation is an expression of murder, as it is said, let the boys grow up now in sport. Donniel, what do you think about why Ishmael was kicked out? And my answer is, Rashi says that Ishmael at the age of 8 or 10 was an idolatrous, murderous, sexual maniac, rapist. How he could grow up in Abraham's house and what that says about Abraham's parenting skills is not something that we want to talk about, because basically the whole book of Genesis is about completely mediocre parents. But so we'll leave that one aside for now. But what Rashi says, and I remember to this day my father teaching me that something that changed my whole life, my whole vision of what it meant to be a Jew. And I didn't know at the time that this was the defining feature of his Judaism. He said to me the following line, Donniel, I didn't ask you what Rashi said. I asked you what you think. The first cornerstone of my father's philosophy, my father's approach to Jewish life, it was a Jewish life completely committed to tradition, in which the sole authority was your mind. The sole authority was your mind. I was raised as an Orthodox Jew in which neither my teacher, neither the tradition, neither the commentaries had any authority over me. I was supposed to learn. I was supposed to know. But at the end of the day, the single sole question that I had to answer was, what do you think? And if you don't answer that question, your learning is incomplete. And if you answer that question through somebody else, you are relinquishing your inheritance, your place at the table. Little did I know at 8 that was going to eventually become the foundation of his living covenant. And the last book that he wrote, The God Who Hates Lies, was the same thing. It was Dovi getting up and saying what I think. I want to tell you what I think. I don't want to tell you what I think someone wants me to say. I don't want to tell you or hide it or couch it in terms that maybe orthodoxy will accept or not accept. I want to just say what I think. And how, through what I think, I worship my God. And so the first foundational principle of my father's Torah, which he taught me when I was 8, but you can't understand anything about him. You can't understand his irreverence. You can't understand the fun he had with tradition. You can't understand his joy of learning, because for him, the joy of learning was the joy of engaging so that he could think. That he would stand opposite God and with God and say that to be a full covenantal partner is to me to stand here. And I stand here not simply as a pious individual. I don't stand here as a loyal individual. I don't stand here as a servant. I stand here as your covenantal partner who begins my religious journey with what I think and ends my religious journey with what I think. And without that, this is not the core of what it means to be a Jew. On Thursday, I'll be talking about the whole notion of modern Judaism, and we'll come back to this notion of the centrality of what I think as a cornerstone of religious life. Now, I remember how difficult this became, because when you go through, and this was one of the struggles which my father had his whole life. For much of his life, he insisted on being part of a denomination in which many people didn't necessarily respect this value. It wasn't always the primary value. And growing up in yeshiva and growing up in classical, where you are trained that you go to school and there is no authority over you. Teachers don't like that much. And so it led to interesting experiences. But it also, and I'm going to come in a moment to the centrality of people, it also created a profoundly individual Judaism. Judaism is first and foremost something about you. You join community at a second stage, but it's first and foremost about you. Can you stand there? Can you stand at Sinai? Could Torah be your Torah? And that's only possible if you create legitimacy and space for your mind and your thoughts. And that's the first thing he taught me when I was 8. And Lauren was correct. In learning with him, he was bored by people who agreed with him. Flattered. Let's be honest, he was flattered. He was quite flattered. And he did enjoy, but he wanted you, just like God did at Sinai. He wanted to be kofel har kigigit, and you accepted miratzon. In other words, he wanted you of your own free volition to agree that you agreed with him. But at the end of the day, if you look at all of his chavrutas over the years, none of his chavrutas were like him. Most of his chavrutas came from disciplines very, very different from his. And he was in search of people to talk to, and people who knew what they thought, so that you can have an interesting conversation. The second thing that my father taught me was when I was 14. And at the time I was in Netiv Meir, which is a religious Zionist classical. It was the yeshiva of the religious Zionist movement. If you were a good boy, you went to Netiv Meir. That was sort of in Jerusalem. The good boys went to Netiv Meir, and I wasn't such a good boy because I wasn't such a great student, but I was a pretty good boy. But my father promised the head of the school that he would help raise money, so he took me in. Never fulfilled that promise, but once I was in, it did. So I had made Aliyah half a year earlier, and I would find myself in Netiv Meir. And in Netiv Meir at the time, all the teachers in the religious Zionist community in the 70s were ultra-Orthodox rabbis. The religious Zionist community had yet to produce its own Talmidei Chachamim. And I remember we had a teacher. His name was Rabbi Asher Shapiro, a very, very warm, nice Haredi man. Now, we would study Talmud 7 hours a day, and that was part of the curriculum. And school was from 6:30 in the morning till 8 o'clock at night. Everybody lived in a dormitory except for me. I traveled home in the morning and came home at night because my father wanted to make sure that I could live in a structure where I'm allowed to think, especially not think like them. So I would come home every night. Now, when you're studying Talmud 7 hours a day, it's kind of difficult to always be on point. And so when you wanted to relax in yeshiva, what you would do is you would ask the Rebbe to give you a Musar shmuz. Like Musar, that was like light. It's like, just give us, some nice teaching about some idea. Can we just not look at another page of Talmud? So one day in saying to, teach us Musar. It's like, it's a funny thing, you teach us Musar. Like, we want to hear Musar. Who wants to ever hear Musar? But he wanted to teach us, but like for us, it was either that or another page of Talmud. So like every week or so, there would be a little section where he would give us a break and he would talk to us Musar. And the teacher that day gave us his Musar. And he turned to us and he said, you are students of Torah. And as students of Torah, you are part of God's army. And it is forbidden for you to serve in the army. Forbidden for you. You serve the Jewish people through Torah, not through service in the military. I was shocked. Absolutely shocked. I was shocked ideologically and also shocked psychologically. I was 4'10" at the time, and I weighed about 47 pounds. No, literally, no joke. Little fish thing going on there with and when I made Aliyah, the idea that I was going to protect my mother, it was like the first masculine experience I had in my life. I had yet to know what a muscle meant. I didn't know but this little thing, and people, when you came to Israel at the time, if you were a boy, you were a future chayal. And Zionism, I loved being with Israel and all this stuff, but I was really a man. And I was going to protect my mother. You know the experience of feeling that a country looks at you as its future, you're our safety net. And here it is, my teacher said, no. Forget that. That's not what you do. You have to study more and more Talmud your whole life. That's the way you protect the Jewish people. I came home to my father, and I said, Abba, how can this be? And our teacher had taught us. He taught us about Shevet Levi and how there are people who have to protect God who are God's army and protect the Jewish people. And I said, Abba, what's going on here? He said to me, Donniel, I want to teach you something. And that night he opened up Tractate Brachot, page 32a. And he taught me, and he said as follows. Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lech red. My lech red. When God said to the Jewish people, to Moses, go down from Mount Sinai, what was he saying? What happened? And for those of you who've been here, my father, and this is one of those pages that you can't be at Hartman for more than a year without somebody teaching this to you 3 times. I first learned it at the age of 14. My lechred. Why does God stop Matan Torah? Because the Jewish people are sinning. Now we know that God stops it because we read the Bible. And why did God stop it? Because God says, what? I want to kill the people. I don't want to give a Torah. This people is dead. Moses, lech red. I want to kill them and start over with you. That wasn't, however, the way the rabbis chose to read this story. And they completely changed it and placed within it a new idea and a value that was seminal to the rabbinic tradition and also central to the lens that my father wore when he looked at Judaism. My lechred, Amar Rab Eliezer, Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe, Moshe, red migdulatcha, כלום נתתי לך גדולה אלא בשביל ישראל. ועכשיו ישראל חטאו, אתה למה לי? Such a beautiful text. Red migdulatcha. You're on Mount Sinai, you're with me. And God looks at it and says, if the people are sinning, all that it is gdulatcha. It's just your personal story. There's nothing's going to come to the Jewish people from your Torah. The Jewish people are on a different page. You think that to be a Jew is to have a unique relationship with God? You think that to be a Jew is to communicate with God and to hear great Torah, which is personally fulfilling to you? Red migdulatcha. Klum natati lecha gdula lebishva'am. I haven't given you anything. Anything. If Torah is not connected to the Jewish people, there is no Torah. My father said to me, a Torah which doesn't, a person who uses Torah to separate from the people, a person who uses Torah as a Lamed-Vavnik theory. The Lamed-Vavnik theory is that we'll keep the Jewish people alive on our shoulders. All of you, you're crap. You're basically crap. You're residue. But thank God in every generation there's the remnant, there's the few who keep Torah alive. And we will keep Torah alive, and through this way the Jewish people alive. Torah is for us, the Jewish people, they're sinning. And if our yeshiva, or our existence, or our community is our own private Har Sinai, we are closest with God because that's where we're supposed to be. And my father at the time said, Donniel, that's not Torah. That's not Torah. Afterwards, he also taught me the Rambam in Hilchot Melachim about how in Milchemet Mitzvah, Hakol Yotzim. Hakol, afilu chatan michupata, chatan v'kala michupata. Everybody goes. I remember at the time making a big mistake and coming back to school the next day. Turned out life was going to be kind of lonely as a Hartman, but that was my destiny. And I had to tell my teacher, because how could you tell everybody? This is in Torah. In the name of Torah, to separate from the Jewish people. To use your Torah as a vehicle to create your own private conversation. That's not Torah. It's not Torah. This idea, which my father at the time used particularly to this notion of Torah separating you from people and creating your own private discourse, and used it in the context of army service, actually had far more significant and wider ramifications for him. One of the reasons why he loved teaching you, was because you live a life in service of the people. You get up every single day, and ask yourself, how could I be a shaliach tzibur? What do I do? What do I say? How do I act? How do I be a mediator so that this tradition could be more welcoming, more decent, more loving, more sensitive, more meaningful, more obliging, more obligating? That's what you do every single day. When he would see you, he sees the type of people who don't live a Judaism on a mountain. And my father never lived a Judaism on the mountain. He was compelled by, what does Torah mean to me? He was on a personal journey his whole life. How do I make sense of this tradition? How do I live in it? But he never stopped there. Never stopped there. His whole life, the reason why he built this institution, the reason why this place came into existence was to ask, how do we create a Torah that could change the way the Jewish people live? That was the essence of his Zionism. come back to Israel was to come back to the totality in his mind. That's what it was, to come back to the totality of, or the fullness of, Jewish life. Where to live in Israel was to live completely committed to Jewish history, Jewish destiny. And to create those type of students. To create students who would never want to just write for themselves, but who took it as self-evident that Torah is only important to the extent that the Jewish people are listening. This notion not only defined the type of Torah he wrote and the way he wrote his books. He didn't want to write with footnotes. He wasn't writing to his peers. He wasn't writing. That's why they hated him there too, because it wasn't like they weren't his significant other. You were, and the people you serve are the significant other. And therefore, all of his books after this one, he didn't write with footnotes. That wasn't his point. But not only did it define the nature of Torah, of his sense of obligation, in many ways it also defined and served as one of the core foundations of his religious pluralism. Because a Torah that only is Torah when it is in the service of the Jewish people is a Torah that is in a dialogue with a living reality. It doesn't speak to itself. One of the great paradoxes is that Torah itself could get stuck on Mount Sinai. Moses could get stuck on Mount Sinai, but so could Torah. It's very easy for Torah itself just to walk around saying, I am some pure construct of truth. All who are willing to drink, come. All who aren't, it's not for you. Pluralism started for my father because out of a vision of seeing people. If you're different, I'm obligated to see you. And I'm obligated to talk to you. And I'm obligated to find a way to come up with categories for it, but that the first core feature of my religious pluralism grows out of the fact that we are a people, and a people by definition is diverse. Pluralism, intolerance is antithetical to the collective identity of the Jewish people. Oh, you could love them in a paternalistic love, in which I love you in order to make you more like me, but I don't really see you. We're not going to be the same. We're not, ever. And that obligates my Torah. It doesn't mean that I have to agree with you. My father could never, even to the end, could never accept the legitimacy of secular Judaism. He couldn't accept the notion of a Judaism devoid of God. And secular Jewish identity for him, secularism wasn't a legitimate denomination. And he thought he was actually very respectful to secular Jews when he would sit with them and saying, you're not secular, you're really Orthodox. So it's an age thing. Like he actually thought that's a compliment. He would sit with, and he loved speaking to the army. No, you're really Orthodox. Because by serving in the army, you're fulfilled. But when it came to denominations, conservative, reform, Reconstructionist, I don't think he understood what renewal was. And he didn't even know about post-denominational, but he got the conservative, reform, Reconstructionist. Those were those categories were important. But it's like, you're here. You're here. The fact that you exist obligates me. And I don't have to have a notion of elu ve'elu, and I'll get to that later. There is a second tier in which you ideologically justify and recognize the complexity of Torah. But in my father's teaching throughout his career, it started with, if I'm serving the Jewish people, I have to talk to them. And to talk to them changes the nature of my Torah. It changes my duty, but it also changes what I say. And it also requires that I allow room for different Torah to produce and to come forth. The second thing is lechred. And to remember that Torah is an obligation. It's not an honor. Red migdulatcha. Red migdulatcha. And a life of Torah is a life of service to the Jewish people. And throughout his life, that sense of service, that sense of making a difference, obligated him and defined him. The third thing he taught me was when I was 19. At the time, I was in Hesder Yeshiva because all good Jerusalem boys went from Nativ Meir to Hesder. That's sort of what you did. And after the Yom Kippur War, the army loved Hesder boys and they wanted us to go, and so that's what we did. And I went to yeshiva, to Har Etzion, very, very nice yeshiva. And my father had at the time just really come to, the first few years were very traumatic for him in his aliyah. And then people started to hear that something else different was being spoken about. And one of the students invited him to come give a class in the yeshiva. Very, and this Har Etzion is a very it's relatively non-authoritarian yeshiva. It's a yeshiva of netto Talmud Torah, very little musar shmuzes. Just study, and they don't get into your kishkas there. Just study. That's what you're supposed to do. I'm not trying to make you a tzaddik. Just study. And so one of the students invited my father to come. When the heads of the yeshiva heard, they forbade my father to conduct a class in the yeshiva. They said he's not allowed in. He's not allowed in. And they thought that in so doing, they were going to stop the class. A room was found, and everybody in the yeshiva showed up. It's like in yeshiva life, when someone says something's forbidden, like, whoa, like we were so wicked that day. I went to hear David Hartman, I'm so bad. It's like you got all of your rebelliousness out for a year. It's like it was little bit, the yeshiva should have allowed it, but actually they were really smart by not allowing it. So this way, everybody was, everybody was like sort of walking with a swagger, like for a whole year. I heard David Hartman. So they have this room off campus, but in Gush Etzion. I think it was in the Matnas, in the community center, and it was in December, and right before Hanukkah. And my father taught a class on one of his favorite texts from Tractate Shabbat on my Hanukkah. What was Hanukkah? And I remember him teaching. And like any child, when your father comes to teach your friends, you're really, really nervous. It's like, it's very, very nervous. Like, is he going to do well? Is he not going to do well? People hate me enough already. Do I need to be hated more? It's like all this energy, and you're just like, what's he going to say? And he taught this text, and it's the first time that I learned it from him, and many of you who were his students will have heard him teach it over and again. He loved this text. My Hanukkah. What's Hanukkah? And the first thing that my father reminded all the students in the room was that this is a crazy question. Because Hanukkah is being lived already now for 200, 300 years. So when you ask my Hanukkah, the only question you're not asking is what? My Hanukkah. You're not asking what my Hanukkah is. You're asking my Hanukkah in order to do what? In order to change the meaning of Hanukkah. They were right not to let him in the room. My Hanukkah. The Tanu Rabbanan. B'kaf hei b'kislev, Yom Hanukkah, Tamanya inun. D'lo lemispad bahun, u'd'lo lehit'anot bahun. That Hanukkah is on the 28th day of Kislev. It's 8 days, and on these 8 days, it's 8 days of celebration, in which we're not allowed to mourn, and we're not allowed to give hespedim. Now, what happened? Kishnichnasu Yevanim lahechal, timnu kol hashmanim shebehechal. The Yevanim who took over, everything was impure. And ukeshegavra malchut bet Chashmonai v'nitzchum, when the Chashmonaim won, בדקו ולא מצאו אלא פח אחד של שמן שהיה מונח בחותמו של כהן גדול. There was only one jar of oil that still had its seal. ולא היה בו אלא להדליק יום אחד. And it was only enough for one day. נשא בו נס והדליקו ממנו 8 ימים, ולשנה אחרת קבעום ועשאום ימים טובים בהלל והודאה. It was only enough for one. It lasted 8, and we made of it a great celebration. Now, this is really a crappy story. It's like almost silly insulting. So, you go, you find enough oil for one day. So wait a week. Like what? He's like, clean the windows more. It's like you had like something, do something. Like what's the big, like this is like a really compelling issue? What's the big deal? The truth is this. But what the rabbis are doing is they're looking for a story to replace the military victory of the Chashmonaim, who for them were a religiously corrupt, Hellenizing group of people. They knew, they gave one line to the Chashmonaim. More than one line, you don't get on Hanukkah. And thank God. Imagine if today in North America, in the holiday of season greetings and brotherly and sisterly commonality, our holiday was the victory of the military victory of the Chashmonaim. We would never have made it in America. Our candles, which spread light, they're just so beautiful. It's just, and the fact that it's near Christmas and shopping, but just the light story is that we could market that one. Go market macho Chashmonaim. No, it's like Hanukkah would have gotten nowhere, and the integration of Judaism in America and the split identity of Jewish American would be far more profound if it wasn't for this rabbinic transformation. But they were stretching. They were adding another story. They were creating a new story of Hanukkah. A Hanukkah which wasn't defined by military might, but it was defined by a commitment to find the purity of our light, the purity of our tradition, to enable its light to exist and to light. It's just, the imageries are just so beautiful. It's not about us killing other people. It's about our willingness to commit ourselves and to dedicate ourselves to who we are. And so this is what my father teaches, and everybody's listening. And then he asks a question, a seemingly simple question. He says, could somebody tell me why Hanukkah is 8 days? So someone raised their hand and says, oh, I can tell you, because the jar of oil lasted for 8 days. How many days was the miracle, my father asked. He said, 8. It wasn't 8. It was 7. Why 8 days of a holiday? And there's quiet in the room. Because in the yeshiva world, when you ask a question that nobody thought about beforehand, that really counts. Now you listen. Why? And remember, most of our holidays are how many days? So 8 is a weird number. 7, it should have been a holiday of 7 to commemorate the 7 miraculous days in which whatever this was, because we couldn't wait, lasted for 8 days. And my father said, what was the miracle? And I remember him saying it, and then in retrospect, as I thought about this and thought about it and thought about it, and this is just so much Duvi. This is just so much who he was and the way he looked at the world and the way he looked at Zionism. He said, the miracle, the 7 days we light for the miracle that the candle lasted. You're nodding because you heard. The miracle of the first day is that we had the courage to light the candle, even though there was only 1 day of oil. We didn't know if there was going to be a miracle. To be a Jew is to live in uncertainty and to embrace it. It's to live in an incomplete world in which you don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. And if you wait till everything is fixed and set and ready and prepared, it will never, ever happen. Jewish history is defined because the Jewish people were willing to light a candle in the midst of this uncertainty. For him, this was the essence of Zionism. His deepest, or the Zionism that he argued against the most, and for him it was antithetical to Zionism, was Messianic Zionism. And when you read his works over and over and over again, this notion of that Israel is only valuable because it's going to lead to, there's a certainty. I need certainty. I need the end of days. I need some conclusion in order to give it meaning today. I can't live with certainty and uncertainty. And my father would say, light that candle. You built this country. We had no idea what it was going to be. You get up in the morning and start teaching a class to your community. You have no idea what Torah is going to take hold. You have no idea when you're going to touch somebody. We don't know. You want certainty, my friend? Don't get out of bed. Life is about living in the midst of this uncertainty, and as a covenantal partner with God, your challenge is not to ask God to provide you the certainty so that you can get through the day. Your challenge is to get up and to live with what you have and to light that candle. And we are here today because that's what Jews did. We're here because for 2,000 years, Jews took whatever it was and they lit it. And if it would have light for one day, that would have been good. And then we would have waited for 6 days, and we would have started again, and we would have been really happy, and we would have had the holiday of Hanukkah, in which and what would have been the story? We looked and looked and looked, and there was no oil. And then a bird flew through the room and came to rest on a corner that nobody had noticed. And in that corner, we found this one little jar of oil. And we were able to build our Jewish life again. And we would have celebrated Hanukkah as a great one-day holiday in which we rekindled the light of our tradition, and we would have said, that's just great. The other 7 days, that's a dividend. The first day, that's the day in which Judaism comes alive. This ability to live in the midst of uncertainty. I remember he loved this concept. He hated the notion, personally. He hated it, but he didn't need it existentially. This notion of miracles and divine intervention and of certainty that would somehow give a resolution and a meaning to existence. And he loved this teaching in Tractate Brachot, which is the mirror text to this one. Darash Rabbi Avira, Zimnin Amar la Mishmei de Rav Ami, v'Zimnin Amar Mishmei de Rav Asi. Amur Malachei Asharet Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Tractate Brachot 91. The angels came before God and said to him, Ribono shel olam, katuv b'toratcha asher lo yisa panim v'lo yikach shochad. You're supposed to be a God of justice and a God of equity. V'lo ata noseh panim liYisrael. Tichtiv yisa Hashem panav elecha. Now, how do we know that God shows favor to the Jews? How do we know? Because it says so. How don't we know? What don't you quote? Remember, this is bizarre. If the angels are saying to God, God, you are showing favor to the Jewish people, what should be the proof text? History. Look, like the angels are coming to God and say, God, you know, the Romans are pretty good too. You got to stop giving all this wealth and all this power. There's other people in the world. Share the goods a little bit. So it's really a very funny text, because the only way that they know God is showing favor to the Jewish people is from what? It's not from reality, because in reality we're in the sewer pits. What is it? Like Rome is winning. Where do we know that God is a non-just God because God loves us so much? In the midst of our Beit Midrash and through the verses that we're learning, where we are constructing an alternate reality. Amar lahem, my father loved this answer. V'chilo esa panim liYisrael, shekatavti lahem b'Torah v'achalta v'savata u'verachta et Hashem Elohecha. That you're only supposed to give a bracha of thanks after you've eaten and after you're full. V'hem medakdekim al atzmam ad kezayit v'ad kevetza. The Jews give a bracha even when they're still hungry. We give thanks even when we're hungry. That I could love Israel not because it's perfect. I could love Israel not because it is the fulfillment of all Jewish aspirations. Not because it's lights for 8 days and for eternity, and that we are an Or LaGoyim. I don't need that level of certainty and resolution to be inspired. I give thanks when I eat a kazait, when I'm hungry. When I'm hungry, I give thanks. This defined his whole approach to Israel. And when he writes from Auschwitz to Sinai, and he wants people to start looking at Israel not for what it is, but for what it can be. And I remember when we started this project, I Engage, which has mushroomed into a major project that we're running here. And many of you are using it in your synagogues, and those of you who aren't, please come speak to me later. He asked me, what's I Engage? He doesn't know what the I is, the iPod, he had no, he didn't even understand the nuance, the whole thing. And he's like, what's this whole thing that you're doing? I said to him, Abba, you remember in 1982, you wrote this article on the basis of a speech that you gave in the 70s? When you said that Israel shouldn't be built around the death, I don't have to love Israel because it's saving dying Jews, but that Israel is a place where Torah could come forth, a different type of Torah. And our challenge as a Jewish people is to produce this new Torah. He said, yeah, I remember. I said, but that's I Engage. All it is, it's this Auschwitz Sinai. We're just building a curriculum around that core instinct. He was really happy. I don't have to love Israel because it's perfect. And my love of Israel doesn't demand that other people see it as perfect. And I don't have to know necessarily that it's going to progress to a certain place. I could just love it now. I ate a kazait. It's good. My challenge is to start. My challenge is to produce ideas that I don't know where they're going to go. But that religious life is not redemption from uncertainty, but that the essence of a covenantal life is to live in the midst of uncertainty. This idea didn't just define his Zionism. It also defined, and there's many of you studied with him, a few of you were his Talmidim on a personal level. It also defined the way he related to his students. When he looked at you, it's true, he didn't like stupid people. He didn't like them. He didn't. It's like he barely tolerated them. That's true. It's true. Even with all of his love for the Jewish people, he had difficulties sometimes implementing some of his pluralism. It's true. No one obligates him to live up to his Torah. We're not. This is a class about his Torah, not about his personality. But when he started this institute, what he did is he went to student after student, and I saw him doing it to rabbis. And he'd put his arm around you, and he'd say, I believe in you. And on the basis of what he believed in you was not that clear. He didn't earn it yet, but he believed in you. And he created the possibility for all of his students that, I'll take care, grow. You could become something. This notion of being able, on the one hand, to live with uncertainty, but also to have an unbelievable amount of optimism. To believe, I can start, it's going to go, I'm not certain. Like, if I was certain, it's easy to be an optimist. It's much harder to be an optimist in the midst of uncertainty. My father was an unbelievable optimist. That optimism made him very depressed, as many of you know. Because every time you put your arm around a student, or every time you teach some Torah and you hope that it's going to take root, you really want it to go. Like, it's like he didn't need resolution, but he wanted it to last for 8 days. One of his hardest experiences as a rabbi, and he would talk to you about it all the time, is when he would give a speech. And he would prepare the whole week for his speech, for his drasha on Shabbat. That for him was his rabbinic. That's what it was. He would prepare for it and work on it. And it was like this was the intensity. This was his moment to take Torah from God and to give it to the Jewish people. And every single week he believed that he was going to be lighting the candle. And he never understood why people went to Kiddush afterwards. Like, it depressed him. He got depressed. Like, after this, you shouldn't be going to Kiddush. You should stay in shul and talk. Come ask me some questions. And the reason why he had such empathy for you is that he knows that pain of the Kiddush after the speech. Oh, Rabbi, I loved what you said. Agreed with every word of it. Give me a break. It's like it's the most vulgar, insulting thing. Oh, you love it. Great comment, Rabbi. Really enjoyed the words. Thank you. Agreed with every word. Bleep you. It's like, we could say that here. Like, who the bleep are you? It's like, come on, talk. I just spent my whole week. And there was one man, won't mention his name, sitting there in the front row, who every single time would move throughout my father's speech. And every single Shabbos, my father would come to him and say, so Harry, what did you think? And every single Shabbos, Harry had control over my father, because he would tell him the candle didn't light. He would say to him, Rabbi, I didn't really agree with you. One of the experiences that we had is that half of every Shabbos meal, my father could only really join the family towards the second half of the Shabbos meal. The first half of the Shabbos meal, he was angry and depressed. Why didn't Harry understand what I said this week? And so he needed Harry to get, and you don't always get to Harry. So then he developed a new style. And you tell me one of you who didn't experience it. He stopped asking people what they thought of his lecture. What did he do? He'd come up to you and say, what did you think of my lecture? It was great, right? Did he do it? You notice it? It's like, this was my father's way of being an optimist and a realist at the same time. He wanted you to say it's great also. Because he could. It's not easy being a rabbi and being an optimist. It's not easy being someone who believes that on the one hand, Torah has to answer you, but that you are a shaliach tzibur. And that without a community, you have no Torah. And without hoping, how do you serve a people without knowing that anything's going to come from it? How do you serve them? And go day in and day out, planting seeds which you don't have a clue what's going to be. And living in the midst of that depression which grows out of hope. And at the minute you stop lighting that candle, at that moment you stop being a rabbi. If you wait for the 8 candles, if you wait for all the oil to be lined up, get out of the rabbinate, get out of Jewish education, get out of cantorial work. You're in the wrong. Go back to the mountain, because you need to be on the mountain. The minute you get off of the mountain, the idea of the first day of Hanukkah, of us starting a path that we don't know where it will end, is our duty and our obligation. So this is what my father taught me at different moments in my life. And as I walk with him, and as I want to introduce this whole week, these 2 weeks where we're going to delve very deeply into his Torah, these 3 principles come up over and over and over again in everything that he wrote. The consistency, which he didn't think was necessarily a virtue, actually is quite apparent. Quite apparent. And these 3 things that he taught me, I believe, are 3 particular things that he would want to teach you, and that he taught you. And that to be a rabbi is first and foremost to ask yourself what you think. Don't start with the community, start with you. And he would say that over and again. Start with you. Create a Judaism that you intellectually respect, and other people will come. Don't pander to people, don't start with you. Are you somebody who has a Judaism that you could say, this is what I think, this is what I know? And this whole program, one of its core original goals was simply to create a rabbinate which has that type of Torah. If you have that Torah, if you're able to teach what you think, people will come. Start with your own internal integrity. And a Jewish leadership which demands this of Torah, demands that level, is the one that will create a different Judaism. Judaism will never be mediocre if we have a religious leadership which asks that question. When you don't ask that question, then you go wherever Jews are, and whatever Jews do, or whatever they need, what you think they need to hear is what you teach. Start by what is it that you think. Remember that to be a Ben Torah is then to take that and to live a life knowing that without the Jewish people there is no Judaism. There is no Judaism. Judaism is not interested in this individual. And finally, that with that commitment to a people, be willing to live with an imperfect people. And be willing to live with an imperfect reality. And to never stop hoping, to never allow the sadness of disappointment to stop you from lighting that candle over and over and over again. If you embody these 3 ideas, not only will you understand my Father's Torah, but you will be my Father's students. And he loved teaching you for one other reason. Because he knew that when he taught you, he was teaching the Jewish people. And living covenant was not only a covenant in which he could live, it was also a system of ideas and a way of life in which it will live in the midst of a people. And you were his partners in making his Torah alive. And for that he loved you. And it's really a pleasure to welcome you here this year as we engage in studying with our teacher. And asking ourselves, what does that Torah mean? And how do I continue that journey? Thank you. And now we have some time. Any questions or comments, please? Yes, please.
So how did you, because you rubbed off in love, disagreement, where did you disagree with these 3 ideas that he taught you?
These 3 I didn't.
Did you disagree?
These 3 I didn't disagree. These 3 became, it's the way I was raised. Unfortunately, the first one made it very hard for me to rebel. because there was nothing for me to rebel against. No. Not only did I not disagree with them, but they became, over time, the guiding features not only of my own religious life, but of everything that I'm doing here in the Institute. This is, for me, this is the Hartman Institute. This is what it is obligated to do, and this is the journey. So I had other disagreements, but since today is not about my disagreements with my father, that's not that much. But on these three, I didn't disagree. The one thing possibly is that I found that I might take a little further. I feel that this notion of peoplehood obligates us possibly to go further than my father thought that we should go. I feel that secular Judaism is something that we have to see. I believe that wherever the Jews go, we have to look at it. Doesn't mean I have to agree, but I have to speak to it. And that the feature of Judaism as a peoplehood obligates us. It affects Torah in a very deep way. But far from disagreeing with these, the goal of my life is to fulfill them. Yes, please, sir.
I noticed in the text about that red, right, it says Chatu Ha'am or something. The people have sinned, but I'm wondering if in the way either your father taught it or the way which you received it, there was a sense that, an acknowledgement or a sense that engaging in the military service was a way of drawing oneself close to a place of potential sinfulness, or there's a Yetzer Hara in the military, in engaging in the military sphere. And to point out also that, in the third text said, your father seems to have embraced that rabbinic conservative militarism. So I'm, only to name maybe a tension between text 2 and text 3.
Perfectly, very, very nicely done. The fact that he didn't go that way is irrelevant, because it's a living Torah. He didn't feel that way. The gift of power of the Jewish people being able to protect themselves in Israel was something that he felt very comfortable with. He was worried about how you use the power justly. And one of the reasons why he loved Ishai Leibovich, he loved him, was not because of his theology, which my father and he disagreed. He loved this man who was willing to be a critic, who saw before anybody else the dangers of that power. But know that serving in the army for my father, it's like it was just, you're part of a country. It didn't reach the level of, because he was a new immigrant. He didn't know army. Like when he did his military service, he loved it. He was what's it called again? A lecturer. He didn't know that when they gave him a draft notice, he had to show up. He had no idea that, okay, he thought it was like a suggestion. Like Judaism as a vote and not a veto. Here it is, he's called on September 14th, you have to show up and give a lecture, because everybody, he just didn't comprehend it until finally, and Yaakov Kastel, who now works in the Machon, had to put a order at the airport not letting him leave the country until he would finally learn you don't ignore. When the army says you have to give 20 lectures a year, you actually have. So he didn't fully understand the way the army works. So it wasn't like, so he didn't get into the power, but it was for him. You're part of the people. That's what it was like. There was an aesthetic repulsion. It wasn't the ideology of thinking that Torah is miraculous and why am I dying. It's like, what's the matter with you? Like, here it is, the Jewish people are rebuilding their country. We're fighting for, your blood is, it's like, what's the matter? And when I went in the army and my you all know, like, we're the white sheep of the family. My whole family is Haredi. When my nephews didn't go into the army, my father couldn't speak to his brothers anymore. He couldn't speak to them anymore. he just couldn't speak to them, and then one died early without him being able, and then before he died, he was able to make some peace. But there was something aesthetically wrong. That Torah can't be that which makes you insensitive to this core understanding that you're part of a people. Torah is that which is given to a people, so how could it be something that separates you from the people? That's as far. He didn't go further than that. Not that it's an illegitimate, and you're right, in the sources, it's right there. You can do that as well, so thank you. Yes, please.
You mentioned that it's hard to like to live in this world of contradiction. I'm not sure how much you really like that, but how do we deal with the contradiction between the first point and the second?
First of all, my father...
But it's not everything.
Right, yeah. So first of all, my father liked contradictions because he liked chaos. And those of you who know him, part of his personality, when everything was orderly, there was no room for him. You say he didn't like it when all the ducks had to be lined up because rules were tough for him. So when there was contradiction, it's like right in the middle is where he made a living. It's like, as they say in Israel, it's like that's where you live. So it's like all contradictions, you don't resolve them, you just live with them. You just live with them. And he loved, one of the reasons why he loved Maimonides is because he saw, that's what, Maimonides writes a book for one student and still writes a Mishnah Torah for the Jewish people. And that balance, like he loved to teach Hilchot Talmud Torah, I think it's chapter 3, where the Rambam speaks about how you have to work and study Torah, but don't waste your nights. Because the nights, my father, is the place when the Jewish people aren't, that's when you can study. So it was all about those balances. My father was not a balanced individual. No, he never was. That would be the wrong term to use for my father. But he was a zigzagging person. So the way you would achieve a balance is not by walking the golden mean. That wouldn't fit for my father. But it was a zigzag. And he zigzagged his whole life. He loved creating a research center. The two major programs, the research center, and he's the one who created this program. And he wasn't a program creator. That wasn't his thing. He didn't think in those terms. This program he created. And he created this Beit Midrash for 30 students where his goal was, he said, to produce the next Maimonides. That's it. He says, I will spend the next 30 years, if I could produce one Maimonides, Dayenu, and he starts a program, he says, I have to teach Torah to rabbis. So he zigzagged. And that's okay. Any other questions, please, or comments? Yes, please.
So a moment ago, you said that practice is not moving up to the secular. And as I listened to the first point, the way you described that first story is really pushing off people who come with authority, who come with knowledge. When you're speaking to people, as many of us do, consider themselves secular, or aren't coming from a sense of godliness and certainly may not have the knowledge, they start with the premise of thinking for yourself. So do you have a sense that it may be worth shifting, the order in dealing with people who are secular as opposed to pushing off of people who are coming with that sense of authority?
I don't understand the question. I didn't get the question. Could you repeat it one more time, please? I understood half, but I didn't understand the full amount. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Could be, I wasn't clear.
No.
So the question is that when you're talking to someone who's been taught Rashi and has that background, then you want to encourage them to think for themselves. But if you're talking to people who are secular, they're beginning, our society begins with the culture of thinking for yourself, and people actually may need to be given an excuse. I mean, do we still approach people first by encouraging them to think for themselves, and will that lead to more learning? learning, or did he give him learning?
Very interesting question. It turns out that this person who couldn't recognize that secular Judaism was an authentic Judaism created an institution in which the biggest users of the institution itself are secular Israelis. And this used to aggravate secular Israelis to no end. Secular Israeli educators used to get so pissed. Why are they coming here, to this place? Why is it that Be'eri, why is Hartman Institute running a network of a third of all the high schools in Israel? All the secular, the teachers, the principals, the curriculum, the students, why are they studying Hartman Torah? One of the things is that it actually resonates very deeply. And that you don't have to ask people to choose. The minute you say to people, your brain, what do you think is part of the Beit Midrash? All of a sudden, they're interested in starting a conversation. So I don't know what comes first. For some, one will come first, for some, one come. It's not like there's an ideal model. Start with one, and when you've achieved this, go to two. It's like at this stage, there's different Jews. Some of them are going to start in one way, some are going to start another way. The one thing that my father wanted to make sure is that either way, when you entered into this tradition, there was oxygen. You didn't have to leave your brain outside. And secular Israelis relate to that very, very deeply and very, very profoundly. And it becomes a place where they could, it's like all the walls could be lowered, because they're not worried that that there's something they're going to be hearing that's going to be antithetical to a core definition of who they see themselves as. Yes, please.
Can you talk at all about your father's relationship to the Haredi? Because that's very different from how he might relate to the other.
Yeah, his relationship to the Haredi, it was not really worthy of it wasn't his high point. No, it wasn't. I wouldn't, he was, it started with an aesthetic anger at this separation from the Jewish people. It really started there. And he didn't utilize his pluralism as broadly as he himself would have claimed he should. But when Torah separates you, it wasn't this mitzvah, it was when Torah it's like, that wasn't his world of Torah, and he didn't always say the nicest things, and I have no need to repeat them. It wasn't, I don't believe it was, I think Hartman Torah has to be better towards Haredim than in fact it was. Yes, please.
Living with uncertainty is one thing. If uncertainty is a philosophical uncertainty, but living with uncertainty as an existential experience of personal tragedy is a very different kind of uncertainty. Your dad knew a great deal of personal tragedy. How did he find the courage to light the candle?
And you saw it also at the end of his life. Like my father had a great life and he had a crappy death. Crappy death, but he had a great life. He had no escape. There was no escape. And he lived both with the philosophical uncertainty and he embraced the existential uncertainty. And I remember when one of the board members was going through a cancer treatment, and she called my father wanting comfort. And it was like my father had left the rabbi, like he didn't even know how to pretend anymore. Like what she wanted from him was some bracha, something that would help her get through. And it was like he was so completely incapable of serving her. He couldn't serve her. He couldn't, because shit happens. It's like it just does. And you just live with it, and it's there, and you go on. And there's no world to come, and there's no promise of a better time. It just is. And it got him angry. I remember speaking in you saw it very deeply, the RLI 4, who, were very, for many of you, it wasn't a simple time with my father. You came here at the time when my father was not at his best, and his health infected many of the things that he said and did. But you were unbelievably generous students of his, and he did what some form of a death vidui to you. And I think you were the only group that he did that. He literally did, and as you saw, there was nothing. That's what it was. And sometimes you're the prisoner of your ideology. Like there's nowhere else. You just don't have anywhere to go. And he didn't succumb to that myth at the end. He didn't go there, and he just lived with it, and it created, we all know when you don't have that safety net, or it's emotionally not simple. And my father didn't live a simple emotional life. Whether reality disappointed him, like the end of his last book, From Defender to Critic, it wasn't his last book. It was the last book that came out, but it was a group of people. They edited lectures that he had given beforehand. He became more critical, losing a little bit of his optimism, but that could be allowed. It was the burden that he bore. There was no escape. Yes, please. Yes.
I think, first of all, thank you very much for everything. And comment about the Torah, which is separated from the people. There's no Torah about your teacher when you were in yeshiva. Today, I think, doesn't just apply to Haredi. We have many colleagues today, as we all, I think, would love to, only teach the motivated and only teach those who are committed. And so, and that's across movements.
I know.
And so therefore, I guess more of a comment, just want to add something to it, to remind us that, yes, it's wonderful to teach the person who wants to come and study with us weekly. It's the guy who sits in the front row who says, that's what we struggle with. And so I very much appreciate that model because it's across the
I learned from Rick Jacobs taught me something yesterday when we met. I think, it was yesterday when he said, one of the new features of the Rabbinic is that it doesn't come with Jews anymore. Isn't that a great line? I said, thank God. It's like someone, like you need a Rick Jacobs, like he said a line, like thank God. It's like, whew. Now, how does that change your Rabbinic? Whoa, like wait, it doesn't come with Jews anymore. Oh my God, now Lech Red becomes much more complicated. Thank you, absolutely. Yes, 1, 2, 3, yes.
First of all, Donniel, thank you very much for sharing this personal message and doing it for all of us. He was an optimist, but as you said correctly towards the end, I think he lost some of that optimism.
Yeah.
It was more than hell, I think. What else was it? What disappointments, what frustrations, what things were really bothering him intellectually and spiritually that wasn't simply only the health part of it?
It was that, the great paradox is that this anti-messinist was the most messinist of people you'll meet. He didn't need messianism, but he wanted it. In other words, he didn't need resolution, but he yearned for it. And it just, we're still eating kazaidu kibetza. That's still, now, when you lose your health, there's nothing more that reminds you that the world's not redeemed. It like hits you front and center from the morning to the night. But he still, at the end of his life, believed that if he gave a speech, everything would change. And Harry was still there. Yes, please.
Two things. Regarding atheists, I actually applied to be the rabbi of a Jewish humanist society. One of the questions I was asked, secular, but are you a deist? Right? And they have all of the same things, the morals, the ethics are all totally Jewish. I'm still trying to figure
not arguing. I'm just saying that my father didn't have a category for them.
No.
I'm not making a virtue of it. I was just being descriptive.
I'm trying to answer your father.
Don't worry about it. Gotcha.
And the other thing was that when you were telling us about your father's teaching of Meir HaMukam, it reminded me of Ben Gurion, what I learned about Ben Gurion. When the last toe of the last British soldier left the soil of Eretz Yisrael, he declared Eretz Yisrael. Why? Because you don't phone America.
Right. Very, very nice. Thank you. Yes, please.
A question.
We have just a few minutes.
I understood the proof texts and the connections for the second and third propositions. The first, did your father find some traditional proof text for what you think?
Yes, that's my class on Thursday. But when he said it to me, it had nothing to do, it was just, I'll be on Thursday, I'm going to be outlining a whole, this, which ultimately becomes my father's halacha and philosophical quest. His whole life with Maimonides and what is the philosophy that allows him to do that move. But at the age of 8, he was just empowering. And for my father, it didn't start because he found it in Maimonides. It started because it was self-evident. He wasn't going to live a Judaism in which what he thought doesn't count. He wasn't going to live such a Judaism. And ultimately, as I said, he broke with his Rebbe precisely when he felt that he couldn't go there anymore. That it just didn't. There were too many limits on that move. He loved Soloveitchik because he felt that the Torah that was being taught in the Beit Midrash was a Torah of intellectual rigor, and that at some point he saw the limits of it. He would never walk without being able to say, I start with what in other words, I'm here. I'm a covenantal partner. I think there was one more hand. Yes, please, last comment or question, and then...
Did he find the Rambam that he wanted to create?
Did he find him? Oh, absolutely. Did he find his Maimonides? Absolutely. Yes, he did.
The question, did he find his Maimonides?
The new one.
Did he find that Maimonides? No. Oh, I thought, did he find in Maimonides the Maimonides he wanted? Yes. Did that one? No, it wasn't the Maimonides, but I think he felt pretty good about his students. And he felt pretty good about you. He did. Maybe we could end. I'll say Kaddish in honor of my father. Chafetz Adonai zakot et Yisrael v'chach yirba lahem Torah u'mitzvot. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, ועמד יברח חירותי וימליך מלכותי, וחייכון ומכון וחי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב וימרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ומעמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל על שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילם עם כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דמירם בעלמה וימרו אמן. על ישראל ורבנן ועל תלמידיהון ועל כל תלמידי הון ועל כל מן דסקים באורייתא דיבה אתרא קדישה הדין ודי בכל אתר ואתר. יהי להון ולכון שלמה רבה אחינה וחיסא ורחמי וחיי אריחי ומזון אריביחי ופרקנה מן קדמה והונדה וישמעיה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמעיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו והוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. Thank you.